So as many of you know, if you've been listening to the podcast all this month of June, I've kind of been using these episodes just to reflect on things that I've done and I've learned as a parent and how those transfer to the classroom and vice versa. Like things I actually did in the classroom as a teacher that I now do as a parent, things that I've started doing as a parent that I've realized, wow, that would have worked really well in the classroom, or I was like unknowingly doing it in the classroom unintentionally, but it's kind of transferred both ways. It's just been a really interesting reflection time for me, and I hope you found benefit from it, regardless of if you have children in your home or not. So that's kind of been my goal with this, and we're continuing with it this week, and we're going to talk about anticipatory conversations. This is a strategy I learned in parenting just from a dear friend who's a few years ahead of me with her children, just about proactively getting ahead of potential chaos. And it's just something I was, like I mentioned, I actually was doing this in the classroom. I was doing it unknowingly and unintentionally just to kind of diffuse chaos prior to doing something that I call setting my students free. You know, I would go over and have these anticipatory conversations, and then I would set them free to do the labs or, you know, do the activity or do the instructional resource in a group, you know, whatever it was we were working on that day. And so today, we will be talking about what these anticipatory conversations are, what they look like, and exactly how I used them so that you too can have a classroom or a home that can be calm in the midst of potential chaos, especially if you are someone who has a personality like mine that runs a little hot. And not necessarily always with anger, but just with intense emotion. I would not ever really use the word steady to describe myself. That's a word I would use to describe my husband, but I'm not necessarily steady. So it takes a lot of intentionality and effort to be steady, to be that calmest person in the room, which another person told me years ago was like the number one goal of parenting is just always be the calmest person in the room. And so that's not easy for me. And these anticipatory conversations equip me so much to be that person. And so I hope it'll do the same for you. So let's jump in. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. Okay, first and foremost, I always like to start with kind of a definition. Like, what do I mean when I say anticipatory conversation? And you could think of this as like a team huddle before you do anything. So like it's a conversation where you're gathering the people in your charge and you're just kind of laying the guidelines. You're laying the expectations and you're laying out the consequences of potentially following and fulfilling those expectations and or not fulfilling. So we're getting ahead of things. These are not conversations we're having in the heat of the moment, that we're having in the middle of the lab where you're like ringing a cowbell to try to get their attention and gather them in to make sure they don't set anything on fire. These are not hot conversations. These are very cold. They're in advance. For example, like I've done in the past, we're going to start with the parenting examples because those are the freshest in my mind. And then I'll share how I use this as a teacher. So as a parent, before we are getting in the car to go to the pool, to go to the park, to head over to someone else's house for dinner or a play date, we're having a little anticipatory conversation. We're having a team huddle. We're getting together and I'm saying, here's what's about to happen. Okay, I lay out the plan. And I understand that my 2, 4, and 6-year-old aren't necessarily always tracking with the plan or even have the ability to remember the plan. Okay, so it's not even just about them knowing it all. It's just saying, hey, let's just talk about what's to come. Here's where we're going. Here's what we're doing. What questions do you have? It's creating space for them to ask questions there. And then I'm really highlighting the priorities, the expectations, the goals, the priorities, and I'm being extremely clear. Hey, we are about to go to Blakely's birthday party. What's the very first thing we always do when we get to a birthday party? And my children now can repeat and tell me, because we've talked about this so many times, repetition is key. They say, we go find Blakely, or whoever's birthday it is, and we go say, happy birthday, thank you for having me. And we acknowledge them first. We're not going to run off and find other friends there that we might be more excited to see than the child that invited us. We're not going to go run and, do a backflip off the trampoline into a foam pit until we acknowledge the person who has been gracious enough to include us. So they know that. We review that expectation. And then I remind them pretty much anytime we go into any social situation, one of my parenting refrains, which if you missed episode 133, I talk about my refrains I use with my students. Well, I used with my students and then the ones I'm currently using with my kids. But one of my refrains is respect responds. So we always talk about before we go into any social situation, hey, respect responds. If someone says hi to you, if they ask you a question, you need to respond to them because we respect all people. From our spiritual standpoint, we say because all people were created in the image of God, and so they are all worthy of dignity and respect, just to give you context for why we say this. And so we will always respond. Now, we also have talked about so many times, it's okay to be shy. You never have to give someone a hug who's trying to hug you if you don't feel comfortable with that. But you can always verbally respond to someone, even if it is just a hi, and then you run away or whatever it is, okay? But we always respond. So that's another expectation we always talk about. And then the third thing would be, we always talk about, okay, hey, before we leave, what are we going to do? And that's, we walk up to whoever the mommy or daddy, or grandparent is that's hosting the party. We say, thank you for having me. Is there anything I can do to help before I go? This is a big one for when we do dinner at someone's house or a play date of hey, is there anything I can do to can I pick up the cars or the Barbies or, put my plate in the sink? What would be helpful? And it's the gratitude there and the respect for whoever is putting this on. And then also, go say goodbye to your friend who's also there. So these are, again, that's 3 expectations. And I have them every time we go anywhere. So my kids have heard them enough that when we start to have this anticipatory conversation, they get it and they can go ahead and they will jump ahead and answer the questions for me when I'm reviewing them with them. But then I also will remind them of the consequences and, maybe in the benefits of okay, what's the why? Again, because we treat people with dignity and respect. Or maybe I'll remind them, one of the best things ever, y'all, is when, this sounds terrible, but when another kid treats your kid poorly and does something hurtful, it's such a great learning opportunity to be hey, remember when your friend Benson ignored you when you said hey to him? Remember how that felt? Did that feel good or bad? And they'll say, bad. And I'll be okay, that's why we are going to always respond to people when they talk to us because it doesn't feel good to be ignored. And so we talk about how that's the benefit of this is you are a good friend to others. And that is a way that we want to live. Or a benefit of this is hey, if y'all can show respect to people who host us, then we will continue to go to things we're invited to. We'll continue to have people over to our house. My kids love hosting and going to social events. And I'm pretty sure they got that from me and my husband because we are really passionate about hospitality. One of our core values as a family is come as you are hospitality and just inviting people in our home as they are without pretense, without pomp and circumstance, just casual gatherings. People are invited in. And my kids love that. They're obsessed. I at least once or twice a week, they'll be is anyone coming over for dinner this week? Who's coming over to play? Because they know that's what we do. And so we remind them hey, if we keep treating people with kindness and dignity and respect, we will keep coming to these things and inviting them over or whatever. And if we do not, we will leave. Okay. So we're going over the plan. We're asking them if they have questions. We may be asking them questions and seeing if to make sure they heard us when we said things. We're reminding them of the expectations and we're articulating what the consequences are of not, potentially having those, of not meeting those expectations. And also, sometimes the benefits of those things too. Okay. So those are all things we're doing in this anticipatory conversation. And it sounds like a lot, but again, you're going to see every time you do a lab, you can have similar conversations. In terms of parenting, every time you go to the park, it's kind of going to be the same thing. Birthday party, whatever, pool, whatever. One of our things when we go to the pool that I always remind them of their expectations is like my big kids, like we're always looking out for the little kids who can't swim. And like I'm really empowering my big kids. My 4 and 6-year-old are completely independent swimmers. You know how to swim. Your little brother, Robbie, who's 2, does not know how to swim. And there's a lot of other little kids that don't. So like we don't hog the staircase, that goes into the pool because that's what the little kids need. Or I'm always reminding them, you do not pull on mommy's bathing suit because mommy doesn't want her private parts to be shown to the other, mommies and daddies and kids at the pool. That's my daughter like loves to just like climb up my body and pull on the strings, and it's stressful, and it's why we do double knots for everything. But those are just like little reminders. And then the other thing I always tell my kids with something really exciting like the pool or beach that can get them really jacked up and hard to think clearly is, and remember, 5 minutes before it's time to leave, mommy's going to give you a 5-minute warning to do your last things that you want to do. And then you have to get out of that pool when I tell you it's time to go. And if you have a bad attitude or whatever, we will not come to the pool again for, however long. And the key here, guys, is follow through. Your yes has to mean yes, and your no has to mean no. They will not trust you or take you seriously, your children or your students, if you do not follow through. And it's hard. So make sure you're only offering consequences that you will actually follow through with. I have pulled children's bodies out of the pool and we have left after 10 minutes. But that barely ever has to happen other than once because it's so traumatic. They don't want to do it. There was one time when I was pregnant with our 3rd and I had like one of those, birthing balls, and I would like sit on it, kind of like roll my hips, try to like loosen them up, whatever. I was using it to try to like induce labor. And my 2 big kids always wanted to play with it because it's a giant ball. Like, why would they not want to play with it? But we had rules around playing with it that were about people's safety. You can't like throw this at your little sister's face and then her head like hits the back of the dresser. There were different rules we had. I always had these anticipatory conversations. And I said, if you break these rules, mommy will destroy the birthing ball. It will be gone. And there was a point in time at the end of my pregnancy where I had to take scissors and pop the birthing ball in front of them. And it was extremely dramatic. And no, I did not get another one. And also, if you think that's really, really wasteful, this had been handed down to me from like 5 different friends. So I feel like it really had gotten its use out of it. But I destroyed it because I said I would. And that was a little bit of dramatic of like maybe a consequence, a little bit wasteful. But the end of pregnancy emotions and hormones are high. And so that was the consequence I laid out, and I had to follow through. And y'all, my kids still talk about it. My youngest is 2. So this is when I was pregnant with him. The big kids still talk about it. When I say something about my son's Nerf gun, if you leave out these little bullets, mommy will throw them away because the baby chews on them. He chews the tops off. He swallows them. He poops them out. We're not doing that. And I have thrown away many a Nerf gun bullet, and they remember. Like my daughter would be like, T, you got to pick these up. Because remember when mom stabbed the big ball that we love to play with? It's just, they will remember. And a lot of those dramatic things, you never have to do more than once. So really, really hold to your consequences. And then my last little tip here with this, before we talk about some teaching specific examples of this, is when or if they make a foolish or unwise choice, and they don't do what you've prepped them to do. They don't meet the expectations. They break the rules that you laid out, whatever. You pull them aside, you remind them of your previous conversation, and like I said, you execute the consequence. And you have to do it with 0 emotion tied to it. This is key. If you're raising your voice and showing that you're angry and you have anger at them for this, I really feel like it wounds them, especially when they're younger. But I think when they're older, like I'm thinking about my high school students, it makes them angry. It makes them combative when you start coming at them. I feel like it's their defense mechanism is to come back at you. But if you can just stay super calm and it's like, it's not personal. This is not me saying you are foolish or you are unwise or, whatever. It's just saying like, hey, ooh, unwise choice. Do you remember our conversation we had and the consequence I laid out? Now I have to execute that consequence. And then you just do it. It's super level-headed, and that is so key. Like your anticipatory conversation cannot be effective without clear communication, consistent reinforcement, and no emotion. When you bring emotion into it, which like I said at the top, it's hard for people like me, it really kind of blows up the whole thing because then everyone starts taking things personally that don't need to be personal. Everything feels like an attack on you and it has absolutely nothing to do with you. And so that's my best advice for that. So Let's talk about how this like applies and plays out specifically in the classroom. The first month of school, y'all, for me was basically just like one anticipatory conversation after another. We're having so many of these. This is a new group of students. They don't know you. They don't know how you run your class. So we're constantly talking through like, hey, this is how we do things in here. These are the routines. These are the procedures. These are the expectations. You will be so repetitive. But if you can just commit to that the first month or so of school, it will make it so much easier on the back end. I have a couple episodes that I've kind of done on this. Episode 33, I did at the start of the 2022 school year. Episode 91, I did at the start of the 2023 school year, with just kind of some things I think are really important to think through and implement and have anticipatory conversations about at the beginning of the year. And so I'll link those in the show notes. But you're going to be having so many of these at the beginning of the year, and then it'll be less intense as the year goes on. And so then as the year goes on, you're really going to be having these types of conversations anytime you're going to be sending students out to do something on their own or in groups. So for example, a test day. The day before a test, I always have anticipatory conversations at the end of the class period to remind them of like, hey, here's going to be the expectation when you get here tomorrow, especially when I taught 50-minute class periods, because I'd gone from teaching 90-minute class periods where we had all the time in the world to do a test, and we often like moved on to other stuff after the test that day. That's not the same as a 50-minute class period. So I would say, reminder, tomorrow's your test day. When you get to the classroom, you're going to be expected to leave everything in the hallway, all of your belongings. So if you don't want to do that, or, at the front of the classroom, whatever your policy is, if you don't want to do that, just come to class with your calculator and your pencil. You don't need a single other thing. Just leave it in your locker. Remind them they will walk in and they will sit down. There will be nothing on their desk. Pencil, graphing calculator, whatever it is. That is it. However your rules are, I'm just reminding them of the expectations before that. And then, hey, what's the benefit of following these expectations? Because remember, we want there to be a pro here, is you're going to have 50 solid minutes to work on this test. The consequence of not following these expectations is it's going to take us longer to get started, and you are losing test time here. And you don't want to lose test time here. And so that's really motivating for a lot of them. Another example is just like lab days. I mean, that's like probably the biggest one. I'm really diffusing a lot of stuff. Especially when I had 50-minute class periods, I always like to block out 2 full days for labs. And then the end of the previous day before we got started, let's say we're going to have a lab on a Wednesday. That Tuesday in class, I would like to block off like 10 to 15 minutes at the end of class and really talk through the lab and what the expectations will be. Have this anticipatory conversation for the first time. Go through the entire lab. I'm always having students while we're going through and talking about it, highlighting, marking things, like write on the lab, emphasize stuff that I'm saying. And then I also like to, on the actual lab day, so that's like what's going on Tuesday, Wednesday when they get there, I hit the highlights again. And then I have on my whiteboard, I always write almost like treat it like an FAQ page on a website. I think about the things that I've seen in previous years, places where they've fallen short. If you have any of my curricula, pull out some things that I point out in the lab details PDF or in the Read First doc and say like, hey, these are things to be mindful of, and have 3 to 5 bullet points on the whiteboard. And I love this too, because then in the middle of the lab, when students are coming up to you, instead of having to like rehash it all, you can often just like point to the thing on the board. And these are great things to keep track of year after year. Like the first year you do a lab, write down the questions they're asking so you can remember to include them in your anticipatory conversations next year, or to put them on like your little FAQ answer page on your whiteboard. The other thing I remind students of, when we have a lab or something like that, is it does get a little chaotic and it does get a little bit loud. And so I have a little bell that I ring. I'll link an option in the show notes on Amazon. It's a 2-pack for $7. So get it and give one to your next door neighbor, teacher friend, as like just a nice thing to do for them. But I remind them like, when I ding this, everyone stops and looks at me. And I tell them, they know, hey, I'm not just going to like ding this and interrupt your work for no reason. Okay. It's only going to be something really, really important. Like, oh, so-and-so Jesse just came up and told me of this mistake that his group made. And I want to make sure that your group, I would never say this to them, but like, if he says something, I'm like, oh, wow, I should have warned them not to do that. Then I'll ding it and be like, hey, quick warning, I just thought of, don't do XYZ, because then, ABC will happen. And so obviously you'll have to make little interruptions, but that's a nice thing too. And that's something you talk about in the anticipatory conversation. Hey, when you hear this sound and I ding the bell, what do we do? And it's like, you stop, you drop everything, you look at me. and I'm not going to use it ridiculously. Like I will only use it for really important stuff. And then the other thing I'll say too on labs to include in these anticipatory conversations, especially if you teach like a 45 or 50-minute class period, is give them very clear goals of what they need to get through by the end of the class period. This is going to help them not feel as overwhelmed and rushed, and it's also going to keep them focused. So like I said, if I was doing a lab on a Wednesday, that Tuesday we're having our anticipatory conversation. We're going to kind of hit the highlights at the top of Wednesday's class period and then dive right in. The goal of Wednesday, that first day, is data collection, period. And then the goal of the next day, Thursday, would be now let's collect class averages. Now let's make graphs. Let's work on analyses. Let's work on conclusions. All of that comes later. I think really zeroing in on being like, this first day, all I want you to do is get your data. And best case scenario, add it to the class spreadsheet. So like if you're absent the next day, we've got it, But I think that really, really helps them zoom in. And again, it helps with them seeing the benefit of meeting the expectations. Like, hey, if you can stay focused and do these things that I'm saying and worrying about, you're going to get through what you need to get through today. You won't be rushed. You won't have to do anything for homework. You will get your work done in the allotted time possible. And for most students, that's really, really motivating for them. That's one of the reasons why I stopped assigning homework, which I'll link my podcast episode about that and kind of how that changed my entire classroom culture, honestly, because it became so motivating for students because they knew I was going to build in enough class time for them to do all the things as long as they listened to these anticipatory conversations and met the expectations that were set before them. I hope this is helpful for you. Just a reminder, you're being clear with expectations and goals, clear with the consequences of those things. You're consistently reinforcing them after you've set them free, and you're following through so that your word actually means something. And we're doing this with no emotion because it's not a personal attack on you if they fail here. They're just humans, and humans make mistakes and we make unwise and foolish choices, but it doesn't have to be on you. But we are going to do this work on the front end to be proactive about diffusing chaos in our classrooms. So I hope you found this helpful. I wanted to let you know I'm working on some like virtual professional development courses. Before I even started this podcast, I had a virtual professional development course called Secondary Science Simplified. And I ran it in kind of cohorts for 2 summers. Absolutely loved it. But yeah, it was a lot of work to almost have it, even though it was virtual and like work at your own pace, it was kind of like a live class, and that we all started on the same day. We ended on the same day. I had a Facebook group with it. I was trying to motivate them through it, that kind of thing. And it was also like a pretty high price point because it was all the things put together and there were no smaller options. And so what I've been working on the last few months and will hopefully be done very, very soon in July is I've been taking that original course and breaking it down into smaller chunks. And I'm going to have the option to buy little individual mini courses on select topics, and then also buy just the full bundle of the original course, which is all of the little mini courses put together. So I'm treating it more like I already have my existing curricula, because I know that not everyone can drop $360 on a biology curriculum. Maybe you just want to buy the evolution unit for $50 because that's your hardest topic. But then after you do it, you realize, oh, this is awesome. I would love to have the whole thing. You save up, invest in the whole thing. We refund you for the original unit. That's what's going to be happening here with the course. So I'm hoping that it'll make it a lower barrier and entry point for people to get PD. That's really, really helpful. And so I know, again, it's hard to invest in PD not knowing, am I going to get anything out of it? So one of the things I'm also working on creating is a free mini course called Labs When You're Limited. And this will be an opportunity for you to see my teaching style, see kind of what's included, and then make a decision from there. Okay, if I like this free one, then I'll probably like the paid PD options as well. And then the other thing I'm really excited about with these PD courses is these will live on my website all of the time. So I'm removing kind of the live feature with the Facebook group just because I honestly, y'all, I don't want to have to manage a Facebook group all year round. I'm only on Facebook when I ran that group those 2 summers. I'd really never use it other than that. And so by removing that Facebook kind of live feature, I'm now going to be able to offer the courses all year round. So you don't have to just buy in the 10-day window that it's open to enroll in June. You can buy it in July. You can buy it in November. You can buy it in January. It won't matter. And so I think that flexibility is just going to hopefully serve more people. If you're interested in hearing more about that, check out itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/PD. And if the courses are not ready, When you go to that link, that will just go to a wait list. I'll send like one email when they're ready. I'm not going to like barrage you at all. But if they are ready, that link will go straight to the page where you can check out what is available, including the free one that I'm working on. If you feel like you could use a little less chaos on your lab days or really any day in your classroom, I would love it if you would leave a review today if you haven't already. And I know I mentioned a lot of links, so you can find those in the show notes at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 135. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.